My mother-in-law shattered my happiness, turning my life into a gilded cage. She crushed my career, treated me like a servant, while my husband stood silent. Suffocated, I chose revenge. I switched her medication and walked away. An hour later, my husband called, panic in his voice. I listened, unmoved, then laughed at his helplessness. The game had just begun. They say marriage is a partnership, a bond built on love, trust, and devotion. But in my case, it was a trap. A beautifully decorated prison wrapped in luxury, yet suffocating in every way possible. My name is Olivia Carter, and this is the story of how I lost everything, only to reclaim it all in ways no one ever expected. I met Daniel Carter when I was 26. I was a schoolteacher in Los Angeles, working hard to build a life of my own. He was everything I thought I wanted: handsome, charming, wealthy. He made me feel special, chosen. At first, it was a dream. The extravagant dates, the whispered promises of forever. When he proposed, I didn't hesitate. I should have. I didn't know then what I was truly marrying into. Daniel's family was old money, built on generational wealth and a ruthless business empire. But the real power wasn't in Daniel, it was in his mother, Patricia Carter. From the moment I stepped into the Carter estate, I knew I was an outsider. Patricia made sure of that. "You're not what I expected," she said to me the first time we met, her sharp eyes scanning me like I was some unwanted object. "I love your son," I had replied, forcing a polite smile. "Love," she scoffed, sipping her wine. "Love doesn't keep a family like ours together. Power does." I laughed nervously, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. I wanted to be a good wife, to fit into their world. I gave up my teaching job, at Daniel's insistence, because a Carter wife shouldn't have to work. I was naive. I thought it was about taking care of me. But in reality, it was about control. Patricia ruled the house with an iron grip. Nothing happened without her approval. She monitored my every move, criticized my every decision. "You should wear your hair differently, something more elegant. That dress looks cheap, Olivia. A Carter woman should look like money. Your place is to support Daniel, not to have ambitions of your own." I tried to win her approval, but nothing was ever enough. And Daniel? He did nothing. At first, I thought he just didn't notice. But then I realized he didn't care. He had grown up under Patricia's rule, conditioned to obey her. If she belittled me, he ignored it. If she controlled me, he let her. And then there was the gambling. Daniel was the golden boy in public, a successful businessman, the perfect son. But behind closed doors, he had a dark side. He gambled. A lot. At first, I didn't think much of it. A few nights at the casino, some high-stakes poker games. But then I noticed the money disappearing. The late-night phone calls. The frustration when he lost. "It's just a game, Olivia," he told me once, brushing off my concerns. "You worry too much." But I knew better. Then came the women. I wasn't stupid. I saw the signs, the lipstick stains, the perfume on his clothes, the text messages he tried to hide. Every time I tried to confront him, he brushed me off. "You're overreacting. Don't act like some jealous wife, Olivia. If you were more exciting, maybe I wouldn't need to go out so much." I should have left then. I should have run. But where would I go? I had no job, no money of my own. They made sure of that. Patricia had convinced Daniel that I didn't need an income, that a real Carter wife relied on her husband. And so, I stayed. Then, everything changed. Patricia started getting sick. It wasn't sudden, but I noticed before anyone else. She was losing weight, moving slower, clutching her chest when she thought no one was looking. The doctors confirmed it, a heart condition. At first, I felt sorry for her. She was cruel, but she was still human. I tried to take care of her, thinking maybe, just maybe, this would bring us closer. But Patricia remained the same bitter woman. "Don't pretend you care, Olivia," she snapped. "You're just waiting for me to die." She wasn't wrong. I didn't want to be this person, but after years of being treated like nothing, something inside me snapped. For the first time, she needed me. And I wasn't going to waste the opportunity. It started with the medication. I was the one who gave Patricia her pills every day. And so I adjusted the doses. Not enough to kill her, just enough to make her weaker. She became more dependent on me. More fragile. More powerless. And while she was slipping away, Daniel was self-destructing. His gambling debts were piling up. His business was starting to crumble. And his so-called best friend, James Walker, was feeding his addiction, pushing him into riskier deals. I listened to their heated phone calls. I watched as Daniel became desperate. And I realized I didn't need to destroy him. He was doing that all on his own. I played the part perfectly. I was the caring wife, the dutiful daughter-in-law. I pretended I didn't know about the financial disaster, about the affairs, about the lies. I waited, because soon everything would fall apart. And this time, I wouldn't be the one left with nothing. Daniel's downfall began long before he realized it. At first, the cracks were small: missed payments, bad investments, quiet whispers in the business world that the once mighty Carter empire was weakening. But like any man too arrogant to admit his mistakes, he ignored the warning signs. He still believed he was untouchable, still thought his last name carried enough weight to protect him from the mess he had created. I watched it all unfold, playing my role carefully, ensuring that he never suspected how much I truly knew. Every night, he came home later, his face drawn with stress, his patience thinner. He started drinking more. When I asked him what was wrong, he brushed me off, muttering vague excuses about business issues and temporary setbacks. But I had already gone through the paperwork in his office. The debts were real, the losses were staggering, and the vultures were already circling. Patricia, oblivious to what was happening, continued to believe her son could do no wrong. Even as her health declined, she remained sharp enough to criticize me. Her words weren't as biting as before. She didn't have the energy for that. But the disdain was still there, thinly veiled beneath her weakening voice. She depended on me now, relied on me for even the simplest things, but that didn't mean she respected me. "You think you've won, don't you?" she muttered one afternoon as I adjusted the pillows behind her back. I looked at her, feigning innocence. "Won what, Patricia?" She exhaled sharply, as if I had disappointed her yet again. "This house. Daniel. You think if I'm gone, everything will fall into place for you?" I smiled softly, tilting my head. "You should rest, Patricia. Stress isn't good for your heart." She glared at me, but there was something else in her eyes: uncertainty, maybe even fear. For the first time, I think she understood what I had known for years. She was no longer the powerful matriarch she once was. She was at my mercy now, and there was nothing she could do about it. As Patricia grew weaker, Daniel grew more desperate. I could hear the tension in his voice every time he spoke to James Walker, his business partner, the man who had led him down this reckless path. James had never cared about Daniel's success, only about what he could gain from him. And now, when Daniel needed his help the most, James was conveniently unavailable. One evening, after another failed deal, Daniel lost his temper. He came home late, his tie undone, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. I was sitting on the couch, pretending to read, when he stormed in and threw his briefcase against the wall. Papers scattered across the floor, a visible mess of unpaid bills and foreclosure notices. "We're ruined, Olivia," he muttered, collapsing onto the couch beside me. I turned to him slowly, making sure my face showed just the right amount of concern. "What do you mean?" He ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. "James screwed me over. The deal I was counting on, it's gone. Everything is falling apart." I placed my hand over his, squeezing gently. "Daniel, we'll figure something out," he scoffed, pulling away. "There's nothing to figure out. The banks are breathing down my neck. We're drowning in debt. And my mother," he trailed off, his face clouded with something between frustration and despair. "What about her?" I asked softly. He let out a bitter laugh. "She's not in any shape to help. And even if she were, she'd probably rather die than admit I failed." I bit my tongue, resisting the urge to tell him the truth, that Patricia had already handed over control of her finances to me, trusting that I would protect them better than he ever could. He didn't need to know that yet. Not yet. That night, after Daniel passed out in a drunken haze, I stood by our bedroom window, staring out at the city lights. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. Everything was collapsing around him, and all I had to do was wait a little longer. A few nights later, Patricia collapsed. I was in the kitchen when I heard the thud upstairs. At first, I didn't move. I let a few seconds pass, letting the silence stretch. Then, slowly, I made my way to her room. She was on the floor, clutching her chest, her face twisted in pain. Her breathing was labored, her fingers weakly grasping at the sheets as if trying to pull herself up. Her eyes found mine, wide and desperate. "Help me," she gasped. I stood there for a moment, watching her struggle. It would be so easy to walk away, to let nature take its course. But no, I needed to play this right. I knelt beside her, brushing a strand of silver hair from her damp forehead. "You always told me I didn't belong here," I murmured. "That I was lucky to be a Carter." Her grip on my wrist tightened for a moment, but it was weak. "But Patricia," I continued, lowering my voice, "it's you who doesn't belong anymore." Her breath hitched, her eyes searching mine, but there was nothing she could do. I reached for the phone, dialing 911 with steady fingers. "My mother-in-law," I said, making sure my voice shook just enough to sound believable. "I think she's having a heart attack." By the time the paramedics arrived, Patricia was gone. Daniel was devastated, but not in the way a grieving son should be. He didn't cry at the funeral. He didn't say much at all. Because Patricia's death wasn't just the loss of a mother, it was the loss of his last safety net. The day after the funeral, he sat in his office for hours, staring at the wall, saying nothing. When I brought him coffee, he finally spoke. "We're going to lose the house." I set the cup down on his desk carefully. "But what about your companies?" He let out a humorless laugh. "It's already gone." I didn't pretend to be shocked. I just placed a hand on his shoulder and squeezed. "I'm sorry, Daniel." He sighed, rubbing his face. "I don't know what to do." And for the first time, I realized something. Daniel had never truly been powerful. He had never been in control. He had always been a coward, hiding behind his mother, his money, his last name. But all of that was gone now. And he had no idea that the final blow was still coming. Daniel had always been proud, the kind of man who believed he was invincible, untouchable. But now, sitting in his office, hunched over his desk, he looked nothing like the man I had married. His suit, once perfectly tailored and pristine, was wrinkled. His tie was loosened, and his eyes, bloodshot and weary, stared blankly at the wall. He hadn't shaved in days, hadn't eaten much either. I could see the weight of his failures crushing him, and for the first time, I saw him exactly for what he was, a man who had lost everything. I should have felt pity, but I didn't. The house was slipping away, the banks preparing to seize it. His company, once a powerful name in the business world, had crumbled beneath his reckless hands. His so-called friends had disappeared, James Walker being the first to cut ties when the money ran out. The gambling debts had piled too high, and now there was no one left to bail him out. Even Patricia, the one person who had always cleaned up his messes, was gone. And I had made sure of that. He looked up at me finally, his jaw tightening. "We need to figure something out," he said, his voice hoarse. "There has to be a way to fix this." I tilted my head, pretending to think. "The money's gone, Daniel. The company is bankrupt. The house is about to be foreclosed. What else is left to fix?" His hands curled into fists. "You don't understand. We can rebuild. We can sell some things, get investors." I shook my head. "There's nothing left to sell, Daniel. No one is coming to save you." He exhaled sharply, standing up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Then help me, Olivia. You have money. My mother left you everything." I took a slow breath, waiting for this moment. "No, Daniel. She left it in my name. It's not yours." His eyes darkened, his nostrils flaring. "That's my family's money." I took a step forward, meeting his gaze without fear. "And you spent every penny of what was yours. Patricia didn't trust you to handle the rest, and for good reason." His expression shifted, disbelief washing over his face. You planned this, didn't you? His voice was low, accusing. I smiled just a little. Not at first. But once I realized what you were, I adapted. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, laughing bitterly. You think you've won? I shrugged. No, Daniel. I think I've survived. He lunged forward suddenly, grabbing my wrist tightly. You're not going to just walk away from this. I didn't flinch. I already have. His grip loosened, and I stepped back, adjusting the sleeve of my blouse. The divorce papers are in the living room. I suggest you sign them. His laugh was bitter, filled with disbelief. You're divorcing me now? I sighed, as if I were explaining something simple to a child. Daniel, there's nothing left. The business is gone. The house is gone. You have nothing to offer me. So tell me, why would I stay? He was silent, his jaw clenched, his hands shaking at his sides. I let the moment stretch, then turned on my heel, walking toward the door. Before stepping out, I paused. I'll be leaving tomorrow. I suggest you figure out where you're going to stay. And then I walked away. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of Daniel pacing downstairs. He was unraveling, his entire world falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had built his life on lies, on arrogance, on the belief that his name alone would always be enough. But he had never been strong. He had never been smart. And now, he was just a broken man with nowhere left to turn. I should have felt satisfied, but I didn't. Not yet. The next morning, I woke to the sound of movement downstairs. When I entered the living room, Daniel was standing there, the divorce papers spread out on the coffee table. He had a pen in his hand, but he wasn't signing. He was just staring at them, his face unreadable. I walked past him, pouring myself a cup of coffee, waiting. Finally, after a long silence, he spoke. What happens to me now? I glanced over my shoulder. That's not my problem. His jaw clenched. You really don't care, do you? I took a sip of my coffee. You never cared when I needed you. Why should I care now? His hands tightened into fists, but he didn't argue. He knew the truth just as well as I did. Without another word, he picked up the pen and signed the papers. The moment he did, I felt something shift inside me. It was over. I left the house an hour later, the same house that had once felt like a prison. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Daniel was a man who had spent his whole life looking down on me, believing he would always be the one in control. But now, the tables had turned, and he had no one to blame but himself. As I drove away, I allowed myself a small smile. Daniel Carter was finally nothing, and I was finally free. I left without looking back. The Carter estate, once a symbol of wealth and power, now stood as nothing more than a hollow structure, stripped of its grandeur, abandoned by the people who once held it so high. Daniel was still inside when I walked out, but I didn't care to see his reaction. Whatever he felt, anger, regret, disbelief, none of it mattered anymore. He had spent years pretending I was invisible, treating me like a possession instead of a person. Now, I had done the same to him. He was nothing to me. Just a man I used to know. I rented a small apartment by the ocean, a place that wasn't extravagant but gave me something more valuable than gold: peace. For the first time in years, I could wake up without feeling trapped, without hearing Patricia's sharp words or wondering if Daniel would come home reeking of another woman's perfume. The silence was comforting. I didn't need the lavish lifestyle, the designer clothes, the expensive jewelry. I had money now more than I would ever need, but it wasn't about the wealth. It was about knowing that every single thing in my life was mine. I spent my days slowly rebuilding what I had lost. I returned to teaching, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Standing in a classroom again reminded me of the person I used to be before I lost myself in Daniel's world. I had been happy once, content with simple things, and I was determined to find that again. My new life wasn't about revenge anymore. That chapter was already closed. It was about reclaiming the years that had been stolen from me. Then one afternoon my phone rang. I recognized the number immediately. I debated ignoring it, letting it go unanswered, but curiosity got the better of me. I pressed accept. Olivia, Daniel's voice was quieter than I remembered, drained of its usual confidence. I didn't respond right away. I waited, letting the silence stretch, forcing him to be the one to fill it. I just wanted to talk, he finally said. I took a slow breath. About what? Another pause. I could almost hear him struggling to find the words. You really don't care, do you? No, I said simply. He exhaled a hollow sound. I lost everything. I closed my eyes briefly, not out of sympathy, but out of exhaustion. I had nothing left to give him, no comfort, no concern. He had made his choices. He had lived recklessly, selfishly, and now he was finally seeing the consequences. I don't know where to go, he admitted. It was strange hearing him like this. Daniel had always been proud, arrogant even. The idea of him being lost, uncertain, would have seemed impossible before. But now, he was just a man without money, without power, without the safety net of his mother's influence. A man who had burned every bridge until there was nowhere left to turn. That's not my problem, I said, my voice calm, detached. There was a long silence, and then, barely above a whisper, he said, You really won. I didn't answer because it wasn't about winning. Winning meant that there was a game to be played, that I had fought for some grand victory. But this wasn't a game. This was survival. I had been left with nothing, pushed to the point where I had no choice but to fight for myself. And now, I wasn't standing on top of some empire, I was just free. Goodbye, Daniel, I said, and then I ended the call. I didn't think about him again after that. He was a part of my past, a chapter one had no interest in rereading. I traveled after that, something I had always wanted to do, but never had the chance. Italy, France, Greece. I explored each place at my own pace, no longer answering to anyone, no longer waiting for permission to live my life. Every step I took, every new experience, reminded me that I had been waiting for so long. Waiting for Daniel to change. Waiting for Patricia to accept me. Waiting for someone to rescue me. But in the end, I had saved myself. One evening, as I sat at a cafe in Paris, watching the sun set over the Seine, I felt something that had once seemed impossible. I felt light. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of the past. I wasn't bound by bitterness or anger. I wasn't looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next fight, the next insult, the next betrayal. I was free. And for the first time in my life, I belonged to myself.